book by entitled, If Not Now, Then When? Please answer us, Janet.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Christine for that beautiful, very complimentary introduction. And yes, I have been involved in lots of different things, as I'm sure many of you have been as well over the years. And I honor that too. I also really want to thank you for the beautiful song, Pass It Along. That was a surprise, and I love that song. So it was great to see you folks perform it. Thank you. I'm grateful to be here with the Capital Unitarians today. I believe that I want to share, first of all, some information and reflections about COP26, about the climate crisis we all face, about the urgency I feel, and the call to action I hear for all of us. I believe we live on holy, sacred ground, and that we are all part of the sacred, interconnected web of life. As someone who identifies as a Christian as well as other things, I see Jesus as an activist who shared his messages by telling stories that changed and moved people into action. They empowered people living under an oppressive empire to create a better world. And those stories still inspire. Jesus shared a vision with those that listened of a new way to live, of a kingdom where love, respect, and justice were the pillars of community. As Unitarians, you embrace these values as well as many others, and I too agree with the principles you hold. We all need to hear stories of and create visions of our future that are about compassion, respect, and living more simply. We need these stories to confront the more dominant ones we hear. I'm just going to share my screen now for the remainder of my words. For example, the story of Canada. In light of the truth-telling and courageous testimonies we have heard in recent years from Indigenous people, our story of Canada has changed. We must acknowledge Canada's history of domination and genocide of Indigenous peoples and Canada's part in the domination and destruction of the natural world around us. We must meet these truths head on and take action. Much is expected from all of us. I feel called to take seriously what it means to walk in a good way and to learn about and support the implementation of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I am grateful to the Sci'anew First Nation and the Lekwungen speaking people on Vancouver Island for the lessons I am learning about the camas, the Garry oak, the Douglas fir, and about ways to support those calls to action. So when I talk about climate justice, I am also talking about respecting Indigenous rights. As I have learned over my life, it is important to think critically and act accordingly. We must be aware of our unvarnished history to understand how we arrived at this moment. And then we must do our best to apply these understandings to decide our actions. What are the structural systems of domination that brought us the climate crisis? It didn't happen on its own. The facts are clear. We are dealing with human-induced temperature rise due to unsustainable carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. Christianity has been one of the key pillars in our Western European ways of thinking and acting that supported industrialization and colonization, and yes, the abuse of Mother Earth. As a Christian, I have often wondered just how we became so detached from the natural world around us that we have allowed such abuse of land, water, and people. This early 6th century mosaic that you see here portrays Jesus alive, standing in paradise, surrounded by plants, trees, birds, animals, and the celestial cosmos, part of creation. What happened to that early Christian relationship to nature and creation? This past November, I attended the 26th COP Conference of the Parties, better known as COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, virtually from my home in Victoria, BC. I was a United Church of Canada and KAIROS delegate on an ecumenical team of 8 from across the country for the Love of Creation initiative. I said virtually attended, rising at 12:30 a.m. each morning to sit in front of my computer screen and join the proceedings of the blue and green zones of COP and the People's Summit. I lit a candle each morning as I witnessed the proceedings online to remind myself of the sacredness of Mother Earth and that I am and we are not alone in our concern in this climate emergency. There were 21,000 party delegates, state negotiators, lawyers, etc. There were 15,000 of us official observers. There were almost 5,000 media and press. A total of some 40,000 people attended from around the world, making it the largest gathering physically and virtually of all the climate change meetings since they began in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. This figure does not include the tens of thousands of people who gathered daily for rallies and the Day of Action, November 6th, outside the COP meetings. Using online technology, we were all globally connected. Looking back at the Paris Agreement of 2015, what was so exciting at that point was that leaders and governments agreed for the first time that it would take cooperative approaches to achieve carbon reduction from our atmosphere. COP26 was expected to refine the details of the Paris Agreement, which took place in 2015, and to that end, it was deemed successful. It had taken 6 years for the 197 plus signatories to the convention to negotiate the details in Article 6 and to get that agreement. This gives countries a universal baseline or rule book to work from as they calculate their carbon and methane emissions and the promise of carbon markets. Each country at COP presented their nationally determined contributions. These pledges are used to determine and project temperature rise or fall. To keep countries on track and to keep pressure up, countries committed to revisit the nationally determined contributions by the end of 2022. Canada itself passed the Net Zero Accountability Act last year, and the deadline for our clear plans as to how we will achieve our stated goals are due in 2 weeks' time. Stay tuned. A key goal of COP26 was also to keep alive the hope of limiting human-caused global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to set even more ambitious goals to cut emissions, adapt to climate change, and provide aid to developing nations already suffering the worst climate impacts. To this end, in theory, everyone is on board, but some say that that goal of 1.5 degrees is on life support. It was hoped that COP26 would establish goals and ambitions to cut emissions in half by 2030 and as close to net zero as we can by 2050. This graph shows greenhouse gas emissions on the left and warming projections for Earth on the right under different scenarios, different combinations of policies and actions by government and society as a whole. At present, 56 gigatons of carbon are emitted into the atmosphere each year. This is what is driving the temperature of the Earth's surface up. We are now at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. The light green band at the bottom shows how emissions could drop and how temperatures temperature increases could be limited to a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius if and only if immediate and strident policies are implemented. The blue band at the top shows where we are headed with existing policies and actions. Business as usual will deliver more than 2.5 degrees warming. These dire circumstances led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to sound a code red alarm for the planet last summer. At COP26, there was a pact made to phase down, but not phase out, coal production of new coal sources. Agreements were made about deforestation, methane reductions, and fossil fuels were finally mentioned at this COP, but there was no significant talk of phasing out oil. On the other hand, the financiers turned up in numbers at a COP for the first time. I think the insurance industry was there too. It may be, and hopefully, attitudes are shifting. However, Paul Beckwith, a Canadian physicist and climate systems scientist, said, as long as there are more fossil fuel lobbyists on the inside at these meetings than there are governments, countries, and civil society, then the house or system is rigged, and it is not seriously dealing with the threat of climate change. Not to mention some of the biggest elephants in the room that many critics of COP reflected on. No mention of military and their giant footprint, which is especially significant now as another war has been started, and completely lacking mention were growth and consumption, especially by the wealthiest nations. In any event, promises alone cannot deliver. The reality is that without better targets and rigorous policy implementation, it looks like we are headed towards a 2.4 degree intolerable warming of the planet. I want to share this little video here with you. It's only a minute long.
Vanessa Nakato, thank you very much for coming to our studio. At the moment, the world is 1.2% degrees above industrial levels of warming. Yesterday, perhaps the most respected scientists warned that it could go to 2.4 degrees. What does that mean to you?
That is a death sentence for communities like mine. There's some connections that we've been trying to help people understand, that there is an actual disconnection between 1.5 and what is happening on the ground. Many of us think that 1.5 is our ultimate salvation, but it's important for people to know that even at 1.2 degrees, very many people, very many communities are facing some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And the fact is, at 1.5, it still won't be safe for communities like mine, communities across Africa, communities across the global south.
Even at 1.5?
Even at 1.5. So to know that we are on a pathway to 2.4, it is devastating. That is a death sentence for communities like mine.
What will happen to communities like yours?
The already existing climate disasters will only escalate. I can tell you for sure, because of the rising global temperature.
Apologies there. Youth delegate Vanessa Nakati from Uganda spoke in the interview we just saw, and she also spoke eloquently at COP26 official meetings. Many vulnerable nations were pleading for help at COP26. These nations asked for funding for adaptation and for losses and damages that they have already faced. Their messages were expressed clearly, but were they heard? Indigenous people globally and here at home are often the most vulnerable and the most directly impacted. Climate change is not a future event for them. They are living it every day, right now. We know in British Columbia that we are not immune from changing climate. This is Lillooet up here in this corner here that you can see. We know how yearly fires and now flooding has impacted people we may know. Yet compared to many nations who have been seeing increasing climate-related disasters for years, we have experienced very little. There was a new sense of urgency at COP26 as compared to previous COP meetings. But outside the meetings, in the crowds, on the signs, in the conversations, I've got a mix up of slides here. Oh well. On the signs, in the sessions hosted by youth, Indigenous leaders, NGOs, and faith groups, the urgency of our situation was much more palpable. The moral argument for climate justice should be easily understood by most people who understand compassion. This is because the challenges faced by those people and communities most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in many cases have had the least to do with creating emissions. Forced relocation, displacement, and migration of millions of people due to climate change has already begun. Climate justice calls us all into action to advocate for people and communities most affected, and to advocate for environmental integrity and sustainability. To successfully head towards a zero carbon economy, or better still, a net positive economy, all parts of our society must mobilize. Individuals alone cannot change the trajectory of carbon gigatons in the air. Yet how we choose to live does make a difference. As North Americans, we must simplify our way of living and stop our patterns of endless consumption of manufactured goods and travel. This will make a difference. I witnessed at COP how slow and incremental change can be for governments and negotiated agreements to be made. To individuals, loss of security and rising stresses at home and in our communities, stresses sometimes beyond our control, can lead to huge frustrations and anger, as we have seen in convoys and border blockades. We are all witnessing how violence and war can happen before our eyes. War not only creates enormous suffering and death for humans, it increases the damages to the environment, the land, and the waters. I know that humans can easily become numb to or ignore dangerous signals, and they are very adept at adapting to, or we are very adept at adapting to and ignoring what others are having to adapt to. Think of the frog heating up in the pot of water, or of the house being on fire, and we continue with business as usual. The challenges before us are immense. I can't say anything that softens that reality. However, to lower our carbon emissions as fast as possible, we do indeed need cooperative ambitions. Our grief for the loss of species, animal, plant, or humans from our climate-related events is real and so important for us to feel and acknowledge. This grief has the potential to immobilize us and fill us with fear, or it can move us into action. Right now is the time for stories, millions and millions of stories, sharing of personal stories about grief or fear, of positive changes that provide motivating feedback, of kindness and compassion, of resistance, of bravery and courage, of support for Indigenous people, and so much more. These conversations must be heartfelt and honest. What we work on together in small groups and larger communities must embrace the principles of a just transition. Everyone can be a leader. My hope and vision is that as we work toward the world that we want, we will root ourselves in love, justice, and respect for each other and for all of creation. Hope will be found in our actions that we take together to stand up against the continuing injustices and abuse of the earth and her creatures. May it be so. Thank you.